All right, it is time once more for our series of lessons in the book of Mark. As you can see, it is, if you didn't know this already, it is Wednesday, August the 5th, and I'm glad that you are joining us for our study. And just to take us back a little bit for a little review of what we looked at last time, to kind of get a running start at tonight's material. We had pointed out at the beginning of class last time that we are in a series in this first half of Mark's gospel account in which Mark is emphasizing miracles. We pointed that out quite a bit. But we also pointed out that what you see, even in the emphasis of the miracles, is also these sections where Mark highlights the conflict that those miracles are causing with the general public. Jesus is very popular because of his healing ability primarily. But as time progresses, the opposition to Jesus is growing among the religious leadership because he continues to challenge their authority. He has come proclaiming the kingdom, the reign, the rule of God. Mark 1 verses 14 and 15. And the scribes and the Pharisees specifically had pretty much established their own authority. And Jesus is challenging that. And so their opposition grows. And so you have in these early chapters of Mark, in the first half of the book, you have, generally speaking, you'll have a miracle section, and then a conflict section, and then another miracle emphasis, and then some conflict emphasis. And we are studying right now one of those conflict sections. And we looked at some of that last time. Specifically, we're in chapter 6, by the way, Mark chapter 6. The first section in Mark chapter 6 deals with Jesus being rejected in his hometown. He goes back to Nazareth, and they just tend to look at Jesus as this hometown boy. They say, isn't this the carpenter? Where did he learn all this stuff that he learned? How is he able to do all of these things that he's able to do? But they said, but we know him. We know his family. We know his brothers and sisters. And they just couldn't get past that. They didn't put two and two together and let that lead them to believe that Jesus was more than what they were convinced he was. So he's rejected in Nazareth, and then he sends the 12 out on what's usually referred to as the limited commission. Limited as opposed to the Great Commission, which he'll get to in chapter 16. This is sending them out, just the 12, two by two, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He'll say, Matthew will record that, I think Luke also. So they're just going out in that general limited area to teach and preach and to heal. But as he sends them out, he warns them that they will be opposed. And so we're still in this conflict section where Jesus says, you go to these towns and some people are not going to listen to you. And if that happens, shake the dust off your feet and move on. Keep preaching, but if it's not accepted, don't waste your time there. Just continue to move on and preach to other people. Find receptive people and preach and teach them. So we've come now, with that said, we come to the last of these instances of conflict in this section, and that has to do with the death of John the Baptizer. We'll be in verses 14 through 29. That's all we're going to cover in this session tonight. So this is, incidentally, another one of those bracket episodes or sandwich episodes, I think we've called them in the past, where Mark begins telling a story, and then he interrupts it with something else, and then comes back later to finish it. Jesus has sent out the apostles on the limited commission, verses 12 and 13, but he doesn't come back to that until verse 30, when he says, then the apostles returned and they tell Jesus what happened and all of that. So in between him sending them out and them coming back is this account of the death of John the Baptist. But here's how this fits into the context. Jesus had told the apostles as he sent them out, like we noted before, that not everyone was going to listen, that they were going to be opposed by some. And this account is here, at least in part, I think, to show the reader here's how bad the opposition can get. So it can get bad enough that it would cost some people their lives. That's how deep the conflict was between truth and error, between righteousness and unrighteousness, and so that's what we have here in this section. So Mark has highlighted, we pointed this out, that there would be opposition, but still the popularity of Jesus was high among the common people. The religious leadership continued to be opposed, and so we learn now, beginning in verse 14, that it wasn't just the common people who had become aware of Jesus, and it wasn't just the religious leadership that had come to know about Jesus. Now the name of Jesus was also being discussed in the halls of local government. All right, let's look at verse 14. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. Let's take a moment before we dissect the latter part of that verse to think about and note some information about Herod. The text says that King Herod heard of it. He had heard of the things that were being done by Jesus, as evidenced by the rest of that verse, as they began to discuss, all right, well, how is he able to do the things that he's doing, and all. So Herod had heard of Jesus, but who is this Herod? Let's go back and grab a little information about that family, the Herodian family. The Herods, or the Herodian Dynasty, if you will, was a series of local rulers that governed Israel from about 30 BC or so until the end of the first century, very early second century, about 100 AD. So they were a family of rulers, and they ruled for the Romans. And it started back with the kind of the patriarch, at least as far as the ruling went, as far as the local governing monarch. It goes back to a man named Antipater. And Antipater was given authority over that area, the area of Israel, as reward for helping Julius Caesar in his bid to gain supreme control of the Roman Empire. A man named Pompey was in battle with Julius over who was going to be the supreme head, as the monarchy in Rome was beginning to take precedence over the Senate, and all of that. Well, Antipater was rewarded by Julius with this area that he was allowed to rule for Rome because of his support of Julius. And so Antipater gains control of Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, that area. And now we don't know anything about Antipater from the Bible because he's not mentioned there, but his son is. Antipater's son was a man we know as Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was the ruler in Israel at the time of the birth of Jesus. And so we read about him, especially in Matthew chapter 2, where Matthew records that it was this Herod that was the one who issued the decree that all of the male children 2 years old and under in the region around Bethlehem, Judea, that those male children were to be executed, because he had heard that there was a rival to the throne. A king had been born in that Bethlehem region. And so he was paranoid, and so he wanted to, he wanted this usurper destroyed. And so he issued that decree. Well, of course, Joseph and Mary had taken Jesus and gone down to Egypt to await Herod's death. But that's the Herod the Great of Matthew chapter 2. When he died, which then was the time that Joseph and Mary brought the baby Jesus back from Egypt and back into the region of Israel. When he died, that whole region there, Galilee, Judea, all of that area, was divided among Herod the Great's sons, and they were Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. Now, Archelaus is mentioned one time in the scriptures, and that's in Matthew 2, verse 22, as he's referenced as the one who succeeded his father. Well, he did in the southern region of Judea. The rulership was divided. The territory was divided. Archelaus ruled down in south, and in the north, in Galilee, Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, ruled in that region. So when you read about Herod in the gospel accounts, other than Matthew 2, which is Herod the Great, and that one reference in Matthew 2, verse 22 to Archelaus, everywhere else in the gospel accounts that you read Herod, it's a reference to Antipas. Now, there will be later Herods that you'll read about in the book of Acts, Herod Agrippa being one of those. But in the gospel accounts during the life of Jesus, we're dealing primarily with Herod Antipas. And so when it says that King Herod, verse 14, had heard of what was going on, they're talking about Antipas. Now, the Herods were, ethnically speaking, Idumeans, which in the Old Testament they'd be called Edomites. All right, so these were descendants of Abraham through Isaac, but not through Jacob. All right, because you remember Abraham had Isaac, son of promise. Isaac had Jacob and Esau, the twin sons, and the lineage of the Jewish people through whom Jesus would come was through Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 sons of Jacob, 12 tribes, all of that. Well, Jacob's brother was Esau. The descendants of Esau were the Edomites, and the Idumeans were through that lineage, through the Edomite lineage. And so the Herods had a connection, a blood connection to Abraham, but not through the promised seed line that went through Jacob. They traced their lineage to Abraham back through Esau. So that fact that they were not of the lineage of Jacob, and add to that the fact that they were in alliance with the Romans, that they ruled, these Herods ruled for Rome, it made their authority very distasteful to the Jewish people. Much like they disliked tax collectors because they were in allegiance with Rome. Well, the Herods were ruling locally for Rome, and that's who they answered to. And so they didn't like the Herods. But interestingly, you might recall in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, after Jesus had begun challenging the authority of the scribes and the Pharisees, Mark 3:6 says that the Pharisees went secretly and began to plot along with the Herodians the destruction of Jesus. And so though the Pharisees in every other circumstance wouldn't want to have anything to do with the Herodians because the Herodians were aligned with Rome, they found a common enemy in Jesus. And so they began to try to influence the Herodians and work with the Herodians to do something about Jesus. All right, so that's a little bit about the Herods. And so Antipas hears about the things that Jesus is doing. His name had become known, and now in the halls of local government, they're talking about Jesus. And they are trying to figure out who he is. And you know what? I had slides on all of that. Why didn't I show you the slides? All right, you got the Herodian Dynasty. I'll just work through these right quick. Antipater, Herod the Great, Matthew 2. Sorry about that. I just got busy teaching and forgot I had slides. Archelaus mentioned there, Philip, and then Antipas is the Herod of the Gospels. All right, so let's go back to verse 14 now of Mark chapter 6. So just like the populace and the religious leaders and the disciples, those in government are now discussing the identity of this Galilean. Who is he? So you see in 14, some said John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. And that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said he is Elijah. And others said he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. All right, so you see some of the speculation that's going on among the people in Herod's government. So some were speculating that he was a resurrected John the Baptist. And they add to that is why he has these powers. And so evidently they thought that a resurrection, that kind of a miracle, would endow in John the ability to do these other miracles. That seems to be their reasoning. Well, John's been raised, and that accounts for the fact that he's able to do these miracles. Well, that was their reasoning. Others believed that he was Elijah. And I believe the reason for that has to do with a prophecy in the book of Malachi. And the reason is because this was the last of the prophecies before inspiration went silent for about 400 years. Malachi was the last recognized true prophet, inspired prophet among the Jewish people. They didn't accept the inspiration of any other books after Malachi. Well, the last prophecy that Malachi gave was this one, Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers. All right, so the last prophecy was, I'm going to send Elijah before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And so this prophecy was viewed by the people, and correctly so, that there was going to be someone to precede or be a forerunner to the coming of the Lord, the Messiah. And Malachi identified that person as Elijah. I'm going to send Elijah to you. Well, because that was the last prophecy they had chronologically, it became a very important prophecy for the people, because they knew that before the Messiah comes, Elijah is going to precede him. And so the studious Jew was not just looking for the Messiah, they were also looking for his forerunner. They were looking for Elijah to come as the forerunner of the Messiah. And so it was a major focus. And you can see that in certain little moments in the gospel accounts. One of them is in John chapter 1, when John the Baptizer first comes on the scene, and he's preaching and he's teaching and he's amassing a following himself. Well, John 1 records how priests and Levites had come out to where John was preaching, and they had a series of questions for him. And they were all questions about, who are you? And he begins by saying, well, I'll tell you this at the beginning, I'm not the Christ. And they said, John 1:21, are you Elijah? See, that was on their minds. Okay, if he says he's not the Messiah, maybe he's the forerunner. Maybe he's Elijah. Now, John denies it there, and we don't have time to go into the reasons why that may have been. Well, I'll give you my take on that. I think there's evidence that the people thought Elijah himself, Elijah personally, was going to himself be raised from the dead and come as the forerunner of the Messiah. But that wasn't the case. John, I believe, is the fulfillment of that prophecy, but it wasn't that he was Elijah personally, and that's why he denied it and said, I'm not. But because that was their mentality, that's what they thought, was that it would be Elijah personally, and that's what John denies. That's my take on that. But anyway, let's not get wrapped up in that and lose sight of what we're doing here. My point is that Elijah was on their minds, that they thought about that. They embraced that prophecy. And so that's why some were saying, well, maybe he's Elijah. Speaking about Jesus, maybe Jesus is Elijah. In Mark chapter 9 and other of these instances where we see how that Malachi 4 prophecy was important, after the transfiguration, and you remember, we'll go through this when we get to Mark chapter 9, but at the time that Jesus is transfigured in the presence of Peter, James, and John, there with Jesus is Moses and Elijah. And then they disappear, and only Jesus is left. And as they're coming down from the mountain, Peter, James, and John are talking to Jesus about all of that. And it's interesting, they don't ask what happened to Moses, but they do ask, what about Elijah? They even ask him in Mark 9, verses 9 through 13. They say, why then do the scribes, Elijah is gone. Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Okay, so it was on their minds. They see Elijah along with Jesus. And in their minds, that's the one who's supposed to come. See, there's that literal thing. And that's why they said, well, why did Elijah go away? Isn't he supposed to come? All right, and so again, it's on their minds. And then one last one in Mark 15, 35 and 36, Jesus is on the cross. And you remember he cries out, Mark gives the Aramaic there, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And as the people are hearing him, now I said that in a very clear voice. Jesus, who is near death, no doubt did not have the physical strength to say that as clearly and as loudly as I just did. And I suspect that's why they misunderstood him, because there were people there who said he's calling for Elijah. And they say, let's wait and see if Elijah is going to come. So again, it's on their minds. Now, the skeptical ones who knew about this prophecy might have been thinking to themselves, if he's supposed to be the Messiah, he's about to die, and now he calls for Elijah? He's too late. Elijah was supposed to come before him. But be that as it may, regardless of the details of all of that, the point is, those are little instances that show us that that prophecy in Malachi was important, and it was on the minds of the people. And so, as these people that are associated with Herod are trying to figure out who Jesus is, they're hearing about him, they're hearing about the things that he's doing, they're trying to figure out, well, who is he? And so some say, well, maybe he's Elijah. And that's why and I think that prophecy is why they were suggesting that possibility. Now, John the Baptist was the fulfillment of Malachi's prophecy. Jesus makes that point in Matthew 11, verse 14, where he says, he, John, is Elijah. He came in the spirit and power of Elijah, literally, Luke 1:17. But he was the fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, all right, continuing. Others had made a more generalized opinion, or expressed a more generalized opinion about the identity of Jesus, and they said, verse 15, well, he's a prophet, like the prophets of old, but they didn't think he was any specific prophet. He just liked the prophets. But Herod was convinced that Jesus was John the Baptizer, resurrected from the dead. Verse 16 says, and when Herod heard it, he said, well, to us, that's a simple past tense. In the Greek, it's an imperfect tense, which is the verb tense that expresses ongoing action in past time. In other words, Herod kept saying, nope, it's John. I'm telling you, it's John. It's John raised from the dead. So, the more these other people were saying, well, maybe it's Elijah. Maybe he's just one of the prophets. Herod kept saying, no, I'm telling you, it's John. I'm telling you, it's John. It's John. It's John raised from the dead. Now, why would Herod think that? This is what Mark is about to get into. So Mark's now going to flash back to a previous time and explain to us why it is that Herod believed that John had been raised from the dead. And so in verses 17 and following, Mark is going to record, or is going to relay to us, a sordid story that shines a bright light on some of the inner workings of the Herodian family. And it's not a pretty picture. And it's going to result in John's death. But let's set the stage. Herod Philip. Okay, remember, Herod the Great had 3 sons, Philip, Archelaus, and Antipas. Okay? Now, incidentally, they all wore the title Herod. Herod was a title. So you had Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, Herod Philip. Well, Herod Philip was married to Herodias. All right? Herod Antipas, his brother, was married to the daughter of an Arabian king. We're not given her name. Now, on a particular occasion, and this is coming from Josephus, the Jewish historian, Josephus tells us that there was a time when Philip was lodging with his brother on a trip, on a vacation, something, but Antipas had gone to visit Philip and was staying at his house, at his palace. And on this trip, Antipas fell in love with Herodias, who was Philip's wife. Okay, so you've got Antipas falling in love with his sister-in-law. Well, it turns out the feeling was mutual. And Herodias and Antipas agreed to divorce their spouses and marry each other. And they did that. Well, that's where we pick up the story. Now look at Mark 6, beginning in 17. For it was Herod, Antipas, who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he, Antipas, had married her, Herodias. For John had been saying to Herod, Antipas, it is not lawful for you to have your brother Philip's wife. All right, did you follow all that? Okay, there's the sordid situation involving the Herodian family. So, Herod Antipas had imprisoned John at the insistence of Herodias, because John had, and here's another imperfect tense, John had been saying to Herod. All right, so this was imperfect tense, ongoing. It's not that John had just told him once and went on with his business. John had repeatedly been telling Herod, this is not lawful for you. This arrangement, this marriage that you have to who John described as your brother Philip's wife. All right, whatever they had done in their divorcing, from John's perspective, John still saw Herodias and Philip as belonging to each other. He still referred to her as Philip's wife. And so because John had been telling Herod this over and over again, Herodias had finally gotten her fill of it. She didn't want that happening anymore. And so we'll see in a moment, she wants John dead. Herod doesn't want to go that far, but he does imprison John because of what John was saying about their marriage. Now, John said it's not lawful for you. What law had Herod violated in marrying his brother Philip's wife? Well, the law of Moses certainly condemned that. Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, both of those chapters have laws regarding marriage under the law of Moses, and one of those laws was that a man was not to use the law's language, uncover the nakedness of his brother's wife, because it was not right. The only exception to that would be the levirate law, Deuteronomy 25, where you have a man who marries and has no children to raise up to continue the lineage. The man's brother, if the man dies, not leaving any lineage, it was lawful for a man's brother to take that wife, that widow, and bring up children on behalf of his brother. That wasn't the case here. Philip was still alive, okay, and had children. We're going to be introduced to a daughter momentarily. But so the law of Moses condemned what Antipas and Herodias had done. However, I tend to lean in the direction that Herod was not amenable to the law of Moses, because again his lineage was not through Jacob, and it was Jacob's lineage that went to Mount Sinai and received the law and all of that. Herod's lineage weren't Jews but Edomites. And so they weren't Israelites. They weren't through Israel, Jacob. Okay, they weren't Israelites. They were Edomites. So I would argue that unless there was some kind of proselyting into the Jewish religion, but I haven't found any evidence that Herod did that, or the Herodian family had done that. That Herod, even though the law of Moses condemned that, Herod wasn't amenable to that law. I lean in the direction that the explanation is that the law that John accused Herod of violating is the original universal marriage law that applied to everybody, that Jesus is going to address later in Mark chapter 10. Now, I'm going to save that discussion of what Jesus teaches about marriage and divorce and remarriage. I'm going to save that till we get to chapter 10 where Jesus outlines it. I'm just posturing at this point that when John said it's unlawful, that's the law that they had violated. Not so much the law of Moses, because I don't think Herod was accountable to that law. He wasn't under it. Now, I could be wrong about that, and if I am, and somebody can enlighten me on that, I'm certainly open to that. That's just my take on it at this point in my own study. All right. So let's look at 19 and 20. And Herodias had a grudge against him, against John, and wanted to put him to death, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. All right, well, that's kind of a interesting set of verses there. Herod believed John to be a righteous and holy man. And so he would not have John executed. Even though Herodias wanted it, Herod put his foot down there. He was willing to imprison John, which he did, because of Herodias, but he wasn't going to execute him. he kept him safe from Herodias and from her desires. Now, Herod would give John an audience. He would listen to John, and Mark says he listened to him gladly. But at the same time, he was perplexed. The idea in that word is to be at a loss, to be confused. It seems as though Herod was willing to listen to what John had to say, and on some level appreciated what John had to say. He heard him gladly, but he was at a loss. I think, it's Eddie's opinion, I think he was at a loss regarding what to do. He believed John was a righteous man. He believed John was a holy man. He had some level of appreciation for what John was telling him, but Herodias was pulling him too. And he was just at a loss to know how to deal with all of that. Did he know deep down that what he had done with Herodias was wrong? I mean, it kind of seems to hint at that. But he also was trying to keep the peace with his wife, unlawful wife or not. He was trying to keep the peace with Herodias. But an opportunity was going to present itself to Herodias, and she would capitalize on it. Look at verse 21. An opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. Let's just go on to the next verse 2. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom." All right, a very generous offer. Basically, he offered her a blank check. Because of how well she pleased him and his guests with her dancing. Some believe, I would say most believe, that this was some sort of a lewd display. And it certainly could have been. The text doesn't specifically say it was lewd. It just says that she danced and they were pleased and he wanted to reward her. And so she goes to her mother for advice. This daughter goes to Herodias for advice. She went out and said to her mother, "For what should I ask?" She didn't want to blow that opportunity. Well, Herodias isn't going to blow the opportunity either. And so Herodias said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist." And so she does that. And immediately Herod realizes the mistake he made. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. Well, Herod had sworn an oath in front of his guests. And remember, if you go back and look, the guests included his military men. There may be some significance to that. From a purely political point of view, to have shown weakness by going back on his word could have placed him in a precarious position with his political people, his military men and others. We live in America. And one of the great blessings of our country is what is referred to every time there's a change in leadership at the top with our president. We always refer to the peaceful transition of power. And every time it happens, whether it's going from a president that I don't really support to one that I do, or even from a president that I did support to one that I didn't really support. I'm always grateful for the peaceful transition of power. And I hope it can always be the case that way in our country. But that in the ancient world was not always the case. If you exhibited weakness at all as a leader, you could place yourself in jeopardy of being overthrown, a lot of times by a military coup or something like that, where you could be assassinated and somebody else take over. And the Herodian, you see what Herod the Great was like. I mean, he's out there, slaughtering kids. Now, we have leaders that support that today in the form of abortion, but I digress. But this was a ruthless family, and Herod could put himself in danger, politically speaking, if he went back on his word, and so he followed through, and had John beheaded. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, John's disciples, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Well, Mark recorded all of that, remember, to show why it was that Herod, again, kept on saying that John had risen from the dead. Remember, we pointed that earlier. They would say, well, maybe he's just a prophet. Nope, I'm telling you, it's John raised from the dead. It's John raised from the dead. He kept saying that. This is why. Because of what he did to John. I believe this haunted Antipas because of what Mark tells us about him, that he believed John to be a righteous man, a holy man, and he heard him gladly. He was confused. He was kind of at a loss to know what to do about all of that. But he knew John didn't deserve what happened to him. But Herod was the one who ordered it. And I believe it haunted him. And he had convinced himself that John had come back from the dead, perhaps maybe to avenge his wrongful death. But Herod was afraid that this was John for some reason. And I think it's because of what he did to John in having him put to death. All right, well, there you go. But I believe Mark records this to show the reader that right after Jesus said, some people are going to oppose you, here's an example of how severe that opposition can be. It cost John his life, and it's ultimately going to cost Jesus his. And so that shows the reader that here's what can happen when you follow Jesus. Here's what can happen when you stand up for things that are right and true. It's what happened to John. All right. Well, I wanted to get into, and I've used up all of our time, but there are some passages. Here's the lesson. We won't go to all the slides, but here's the lesson. Even though following Jesus brings with it blessings that are wonderful beyond measure, following Jesus is not always a pleasant life. It brings blessings that you will never experience anywhere else. And blessings that not just in this life, but certainly blessings in eternity. But it's not always going to be pleasant. We are going to be opposed sometimes. And it may be that opposition takes us even to the point of death. But what do? Well, we follow Jesus because there is reward in this life and especially in the next for doing that. And Jesus, there are a lot of passages where Jesus warned his disciples that would be the case. If they hated me, they're going to hate you. John 15 and other passages. So that's the lesson to take from it. Be loyal to Jesus, but recognize that you're not always going to be accepted because you're loyal to Jesus. But it's the only way to live, and it's certainly the only way to die. Let's pray. Father, thank you for, again, a good period of study in your word. We thank you for the great example that John left us of loyalty to what's right. And it's our prayer that we would be strong in our allegiance to you and our allegiance to Jesus, that we would be willing to make any sacrifice, regardless of what it is, to follow him and to follow him with every ounce of our being. We pray, Father, that we would deepen our relationship with him to such a degree that we would count it all joy to suffer if called upon for him. In his name we pray. Amen. All right. There you go. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll do it again soon. We'll continue our study of Mark, finish up chapter 6, and go on into chapter 7. Love you guys.